This is your captain speaking. And no, we're not at 35,000 feet, we're not going to be. All I want to do is say a few brief words about the history of Cathay that may be not well known, and the rest of its history. Questions back to the audience, excluding the Cathay people down the end. How many people in the room have actually flown on Cathay? Hands up, please. Quite a few. How many ventured to put your hand in the seat pocket in front of you and pull out the glossy magazine that told you all about the movies, the expensive watches that you didn't have to buy, perfume for the ladies, etc.? If you read the book, the first couple of pages also covered the history and how Cathay started 75 years ago. Next question. Who understands, hands up please, what flying the hump means? A few historians, okay. To explain then, flying the hump. When China was overrun during wartime and their regular lines of supply down the east coast were all cut off as far as Burma, all the western parts of China had no line of supply. So various divisions of Air Force, ultimately from the 10th Air Force, set up DC-3 flight lines from northern India in Assam across the Himalayas to Kunming in western China, flying the hump. DC-3s, a daily service, sometimes more than one, and it went from April 1942 till August 1945. They lost a lot of people and lost a lot of aeroplanes, but that was the main supply route to Western China. Going on from that, at the end of the war, a lot of these people were displaced citizens, and two of them, an American and an Australian, found themselves in Hong Kong with itchy feet and, I guess, pipe dreams of how they could resupply Hong Kong, which at that stage was hurting for goods. So the obvious thing, being hump pilots, they thought, well, why don't we get an aeroplane and supply Hong Kong and those parts of nearby China from Australia. The Americans at this stage, post-war, had lots and lots of aircraft that were up for disposal, which were being sold out of mainly New York. So the two guys, Roy Farrell, the American, and Sid de Cansow, the Australian, they got themselves to New York. I don't know how they did that, but they bought a DC-3 at auction in New York. And then the next mission, of course, was to get it back to Hong Kong, which required, in those post-war years, lots and lots of clearances, which were not forthcoming. So their answer to that, how to beat the system, they bought some very cheap medical supplies, bandages and all that sort of stuff, and they loaded the airplane up, and it became a mercy mission, a medical emergency mission, and they flew it the long way around then from New York to Hong Kong. And I guess then after the dust had settled and they got their breath back, it was to go to Australia and kick off their freight service back to Hong Kong. Now, they formed a company, and of course then they needed to name it. Cathay came to mind immediately because Europeans always referred to China as Cathay, not China. So Cathay became the obvious first name, and Roy Farrell, being the American, always had the pipe dream that he wanted the service, if it ventured further, to go across the Pacific. So the name Cathay Pacific was born. And their first service, 75 years ago today. The rest of it is history. Okay, the airline developed, and up to the beginning of last year, pre-COVID, they were operating about 160 aircraft, which we see in the press all the time. It obviously has suffered, they're looking for greener pastures. That's the history. To support the history, and just a couple of things that I don't think too many people in the room would know. In June 1946, 1948, Cathay's commercial aircraft to be hijacked in the world. And they were operating a Catalina freight service and passengers from Macau up to Hong Kong. And three bandits thought the idea that this aeroplane normally carried fairly wealthy people and or gold, and they decided that they would steal or hijack the aeroplane, and they got the services of a fourth gentleman, a Mr. Wong, who knew all about the outer islands around Macau. And the deal was, he was going to, they were going to hijack the aeroplane, and one of the bad guys was a pilot. They wanted to take over the Catalina and landed at one of these outer islands and ransom the passengers. During the flight, the captain of the Catalina, he didn't submit to the threats from the bad guys, and a firefight ensued and the aeroplane crashed. There was only one survivor, and that was Mr. Wong, who was to be who knew where the islands were. Mr. Wong was thrown out of the back of the aeroplane and subsequently rescued and finished up in hospital in Hong Kong. When they retrieved the fuselage from the ocean and found all the bullet holes in it, and, well, I'll go back a bit. Initially they thought nothing was suspicious. When they found the bullet holes in the aeroplane, that changed the story, and Mr. Wong wasn't helping them that much, so they put an undercover policeman in, and it took 3 months, but Mr. Wong started talking and telling him a little bit of his adventures, and they had enough information then, so they arrested him. You could read this if you wish. You may ask the question, what happened to him? Because the crash of the Catalina was halfway between Macau and Hong Kong, Macau being Portuguese and Hong Kong a British colony, there was confusion about who should look after Mr. Wong. And eventually he was released and he went back to Macau and he lived as a free man for a couple of years, but it is rumoured then that the Chinese said, "You're a bad lad," and he was executed. That's not confirmed. That was June 1948. 6 years later, the next incident of merit for Cathay, they had a DC-4 which was flying again on a flight route from Bangkok to Hong Kong, passengers, and it was all silver with very little livery on the side of it. And it was rumoured that Kai-shek from Formosa was on board that aeroplane. So the Chinese People's Liberation Air Force sent out 2 fighters and they shot the aeroplane down. It crashed in the ocean. It was ditched in the ocean. Half the people got out. Well, I think there was only 20-something on board it, but half of them got out. And the people that were in the water were subsequently rescued by an American Albatross out of, or Clark Air Base, sorry. And that was 1954. Oh, one thing about the DC-4, the Chinese were never questioned about shooting down the DC-4, but absolutely unannounced and without any questions being asked, the amount of money you needed to pay to buy a brand new DC-4 appeared in the Cathay bank account the next day. No references, no nothing. Rather ironic. And the next major incident of Cathay was 1972, and again a flight from Bangkok to Hong Kong, this one being a Convair 880, and Cathay aeroplanes in those days were nearly always on time because there was little traffic, and if you said you were leaving at such and such an hour, that's when you left. There were no flight delays. A lovely gentleman called Lieutenant Somchai in Bangkok was part of the supposedly security force on the base, on the airport at Dong Muang in Bangkok, and he placed a bomb underneath the seat of his de facto wife and his paternal daughter. And he had a plan of all the seating of the Convair, and he changed their seating so they're over the centre part of the wing and the fuselage. It was a time bomb, and that flight that day, first time ever, it left 20 minutes late. So instead of being over the ocean where it would have blown up, it blew up over Vietnam. There was a big investigation into it. They brought explosives people out from one of the universities in the UK, and they worked it all out. And Mr. Lieutenant Somchai, they knew he was the bad guy behind it all, and his father was a High Court judge in Thailand, so he was hidden and moved out of the way. Because one of the families on board the Convair was a very wealthy Chinese family, and everybody knew there'd be a marker out to get Mr. Somchai. Why did he do it? Insurance, $110,000 is in 1972. And the case went on for a couple of years, and sadly, eventually, he was cleared, and the insurance company had to pay him out. And like good karma, about a month or two after he got the money, he died of cancer. So, the end of that. I remember the date well, being the 15th of June, 72, I was rostered for that flight. And as luck would have it, they changed the flight from a, should have been a 707, which I was flying, and they switched it to a Convair, so I stayed on the ground. Incidents. The aftermath of the Convair plane, all of you who've travelled since 1972 would appreciate that when you're leaving an airport now, we all get searched, in as much as our hand carrier has to go through x-rays, etc., etc. That all started in the aftermath of the Cathay plane in 1972. And Betsy, the DC-3, the original aeroplane, it is now back in Hong Kong. But how it happened, it left Hong Kong, it went to New Guinea, it did time with Ansett, it went to Queensland, and its last commercial service was for Bush Airways in Queensland. And then through a group in Hong Kong, they organised Cathay to buy it back, and it was flown back to Hong Kong and dismantled, transported into the museum in Hong Kong and put back together. So it now resides in the Hong Kong Science Museum. Thank you very much.